Shabbat Shalom. I haven't seen any of you really since 2022, so Happy New Year. As some of you may know, my family left on the 31st of December for Europe, and we spent, it was sort of luxurious. We got to spend 10 days in Paris and in Rome. And we were actually in Rome for the Pope's funeral, which was fascinating. We went to the Vatican the day after the funeral, which was fascinating, and we obviously didn't plan that, but it worked out as such and was really interesting. But for me personally, and truly me alone and my family, the real highlight was something at the Louvre. So raise your hand if you've been to the Louvre. Raise your hand if you remember seeing the Code of Hammurabi. Yeah, not so many, right? See how that works? However, if you have ever studied the Hebrew Bible from an academic or critical lens, there is no understanding or appreciation of the Torah unless you know what the Code of Hammurabi is. And in the Louvre is the Code of Hammurabi, 7 feet tall, made out of a black, shiny stone that is very, very difficult to chisel as it happens. And that is significant because it was chiseled in the 18th century BCE. With over 240 rules or laws that we understand in the world as the oldest complete set of law code in hand. That's it. That's where it starts for us. It's not to say that there weren't older codes, but we don't have them in totality. But should you be in the Louvre and not willing to stand in the line to see the Mona Lisa, which is a horrific line, should you want to know, you might make your way down through a maze into the antiquities section and find the Code of Hammurabi. Why this matters for anyone interested in Torah is because it is largely believed that the Torah bases itself off of the Code of Hammurabi. However, the variance is, whereas the Code of Hammurabi deals with brutal laws rooted in punishment for misbehavior, and it bases its codes and its punishments on the class of person in the society, meaning the punishments were less if a rich person were to offend than a poor person or a slave. The Torah takes the same basic laws of justice, but makes them singular and one for all, meaning it creates a system of equity. In addition, it adds in laws for spiritual practice, laws for national identity, and ultimately, laws of morality, not just laws of punishment, but laws of loving your neighbor, laws of caring for the poor. And it brings to bear the foundational notion that however one chooses to understand the place from which the Torah began, it is very difficult to argue that the Torah was not designed to make the world more Jewish, but rather it was surely designed to make the world more human. And it is from that place that I'd like us to go. We're going to get kind of Jewish, guys. I warned this at the beginning for those who were here. I tend to not spend so much time in a Devar Torah really focusing on Jewish text. I like to really bring us into the contemporary world. But I hope that these texts that I'd like to share with you now will resonate for you as incredibly contemporary, holding them in their place. So if you were to consider the book of Genesis, Breshit, and try to identify the foundational problem or trope that continues to repeat itself as a theme over and over and over again, what might you say that was? Cantor Goldstein, you can't answer this question because you already know the answer. We talked about it earlier. Anyone want to guess? I'll tell you, it starts with a pair named Cain and Abel. Well, it's a real question, not rhetorical. What do you think? Strife amongst siblings, so exactamundo, right? So the minute humanity gets out of the garden, right, where strife isn't a thing, or is it maybe, but that's a different question, a different conversation. We are led ultimately into the story of Cain and Abel. And how does that sibling relationship work out? Not so great, right? And we're not in the Jewish narrative yet, we're just in the human narrative. But if we move forward, the next big one that we get to are two guys named Jacob and Esau. How's that one going? Not so great. Rooted in distrust, rooted in power usurping, not holding to the system as the society invited it to understand itself, filled with pain, and perhaps some resolution, sort of, toward the end of their relationship. But if anything, it was a, let's call it, cold peace that existed between them. And ultimately, the book of Genesis ends with a story made quite famous in a musical. Joseph. What sort of relationship does Joseph have with his brothers? Not a great one, right? You remember the story. Joseph is favored by whom? His father. This is known. He's actually, interestingly, if you see the cycle of a family illness kind of play forward, a family dysfunction play forward, when Jacob comes to confront Esau after 20 years of estrangement, Jacob is frightened that Esau is going to kill his entire family. And because he's such a great guy, he decides to take his many wives and many children and put them in order of preference, with the least favored closest to his brother, back, protecting Rachel and Joseph closest to him. So Joseph actually witnesses this as a young tot. And this relationship dynamic plays out. You likely remember the story, right? Joseph has dreams. Besides knowing that he is his father's favorite, he has dreams of ruling over his brothers. Information that he keeps to himself? No, information that he shares with them excitedly. Hey guys, I had great dreams about our future together. You're going to bow down to me. It's not received well. How does the story play out? What happens? What do they want to do to him? They want to kill him, but decide that might be messy. So instead, right, and that would truly be, if you think about it in a literal narrative, in a literary narrative, the ultimate regression back to the beginning of the story, to Cain and Abel. Fratricide, right? So the story can't work that way because it's a story and it's a book and it has to move. So instead, they sell him into slavery. And where does that take Joseph? What place? Egypt, where he becomes vice president of Egypt. Second in command, ultimately, in an incredible position of power, not only over the nation, but again over whom? His brothers, who ultimately find him and end up bowing down to him, begging for their lives, the life of the other favored brother, Benjamin, ultimately. And the story ends with them all together again, but you have to wonder about their dinner table conversation. Something else happens at the end of that story. Does Joseph, well, I'm just going to tell you for the sake of time. Joseph, in his service under the Pharaoh of Egypt, actually takes on an Egyptian identity. He gets an Egyptian name, and when he finally dies, he is placed into a metal casket, says the Midrash, and thrown into the Nile River by the Egyptians. And that ends, ultimately, the book of Genesis. So if it were like a telenovela, it would really work well. But the story's not over. The Torah doesn't end in the book of Genesis. What begins in the next book, the book of Exodus, is not the story of Jewish individuals, but rather the Jewish people. Because we learn that Joseph and his brothers yielded many, many, many people. They became a great nation. And we meet ultimately who? Moses. Now, Moses, how do we meet Moses? In a basket, which is kind of like a box. And where is that basket in that box? In the water. What water? The Nile. Isn't that interesting? And what happens to him? He's found by the daughter of Pharaoh and taken out of the Nile in a box and becomes the prince of Egypt. Isn't that interesting? Do you start to see where the Joseph story ends and the Moses story begins in parallel? A box in the Nile, Egyptian royalty, Jewish boys. Ultimately, though, Moses, as Egyptian royalty, goes out amongst his real people and notices what? Oppression, in particular, what? Yes, incredible abuse of a fellow Hebrew, which we don't know if Moses even knows that these are his people at this point. There's actually arguments in the commentary about that. But either way, something speaks to Moses and says, this isn't right, and he stands up for what is happening to save the Hebrew, the Jewish person being abused, beaten, tortured by an Egyptian taskmaster. And what's the result? Well, he kills him, yes, and then he has to run away because he is fearful that he's going to get killed. Long story made short, he ends up in the wilderness, as you know, and he's a shepherd, and he happens to make his way to a burning bush. You can picture this in the movie The Prince of Egypt or in the movie The Ten Commandments, whatever visual you need to bring about this scene. Are you with me? Do you know where we are in the story? Okay, because this is where it starts to get very, very cool. He meets God. Doesn't see God, he just sees this bush, but he hears the voice of God. God's like, Moses. I am doing the voice of God, Stanton. Moses introduces himself, introduces God's self, says, my name is Asher Ayeh, I will be what I will be, and I have a job for you. I would like you to be the leader of the people and help free your brethren, and it's going to be great. And Moses feels, yes, great. He says, no, I don't want that job. Why me? I'm a shepherd. I don't want to go back there. I'm not your guy. Find a different guy. And God says, no, you're the guy. And they go back and forth, and ultimately, Moses says to God, listen, I have no ability to speak in public. Literally, no one will listen to me. I'm uncomfortable speaking. And God says to Moses, don't worry. We'll have someone help you. Who is the person? Aaron. And who is Aaron? Moses' brother. And this is the part that they don't teach you in Hebrew school, and it's not in the movies. After Aaron is introduced, right? And Aaron is the older brother. So understand the power dynamic at play again. Right? What comes right after that is the Torah saying that God says, and Aaron is coming, and he is happy in his heart to take on this role. And Aaron is happy in his heart to take on that role. Which means what? What does it mean that he's happy in his heart to take on the role of number 2 to Moses, his younger brother? What's happened? The story has switched. How? No more jealousy. Right? Every other time, look, the first time it led to murder. The second time it led to 20 years of estrangement and the building of 2 different nations. The third time it landed in ultimate overlording, literally, of the other brothers. But here, the narrative has switched, right? So come back to Genesis. If the trope in Genesis is the problem with sibling relationships, and we look at the pattern, it seems to suggest that jealousy in sibling relationships leads you where? Where do we end Genesis and begin Exodus? Enslaved. And what happens right after Aaron comes in to be the number 2 helper to Moses? Where do they go next? Let my people go. Where does redemption come? It comes from understanding that there need not be jealousy and power dynamics between one another. Ultimately, it's very fascinating. Rashi actually says, what was the reward for Aaron being happy in his heart? And Rashi says that's why Aaron became the line of the priesthood. He was actually given an entirely new line of power because he was able to humble himself in a larger dynamic. Everyone was able to get out of their own spaces to see a higher purpose. And it's from that place that redemption comes. You don't actually get Jewish peoplehood until after this episode in the story. There is no Jewish peoplehood until the Torah corrects sibling rivalry. And I don't think it's just about literal siblings, because it wouldn't then birth the collective narrative. It's as if the tradition is telling us the key for any sort of promise for betterment, redemptive experience for any people. That it has to be about a shared higher purpose. It has to be about seeing your brother in the other above yourself. And ultimately, it lets you know that just because it seems like one story has been written and is over and is sealed, there's always another opportunity to write another story. In our individual relationships with our brothers, with our own siblings, with our family members, but certainly in the narrative of our collective experience, hopefully always looking to make our world better, stronger, gentler, more humble, of higher and shared purpose. Our Torah wasn't written to make the world more Jewish. Our Torah was written to make the world more human. And we're writing new chapters every day. Monday's Dr. Martin Luther King Day. An incredible opportunity to write a new chapter. Even if you already feel like there's no point in writing it because the story is already written, there's another story to be written. I hope you'll join the larger North Shore community at the AME Church in Glencoe on Sunday morning at 10:30 followed by a service project at Am Shalom shared by all of the religious institutions in Glencoe. I believe that's at 1. Does that sound about right? 1 o'clock-ish? It's on our Facebook page. Check it there for the times. And then if you're interested in continuing to be a part of a larger interfaith journey about writing a new chapter, you can join us as we do every year, joining the larger interfaith community in the Chicagoland area at the Stone Temple Church in Lawndale, 10:30 on Monday morning. Always an incredible experience every year to be there. The stories aren't sealed. Hammurabi's code wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. We're the writers now. I hope the chapters we write together will always be driving us toward being more human. Shabbat Shalom.